Yeah. All right. So, guys, thanks for joining us today. The GBC Analytics Club welcomes you. Uh, none of our officers for the club are on today, but they say thanks for coming. They're probably taking a break after all of the competition work last week. I want to remind everybody about the speakers series that are coming up. Nate's on the call today, and he's going to continue with his blockchain discussions. We also have our graduations. Cameron, are you going to that? The graduation party on Friday?
Yeah, I think so.
Woo-woo! Bring your drinks. And then we have Olivia, who is a professor, and she's written some books on soft skills for data scientists. And Reddy's going to talk about the experience of a new Canadian in the hiring process in Canada. Today we are welcoming Nathaniel, and he's going to talk about the future of work. And I'm handing it over to you now, Nathaniel, sorry.
It's all good. I go by either. It's just to avoid confusion with the other Nathaniel here. I usually go by Nate, or he goes by Nate. All right. So I'm going to be talking about the future of work in various aspects today. I'd like to start with one question for everyone here, which is, how do you think that work/education has changed in the recent events that have taken place, and do you think that's had a positive impact or a negative impact on how you've performed, whether it's through school or work? Do you guys have any thoughts on those questions? You can either answer through voice or chat, either or.
That's a good question. What do you guys think?
For me, I know that since I have less things to do, I haven't managed a work-life balance as well as I used to. So I'm definitely working more.
It seeps in, huh? Michael, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think there's both pros and cons. And just to go off of what Nate said, there's less distractions. So definitely doing a lot more working and learning.
Awesome.
Less options to go outside.
Yeah. So that's kind of one of the topics that I'm going to be covering. What would you guys say, another last question before I kind of dive into this, what do you guys think are the major differences between office work and remote work? What do you guys think when you think of like people who work in an office space with a bunch of other people around them versus someone who stays at home and usually relies on meetings and group chats to communicate to other people? What do you guys think are the major differences there?
To me, I feel like, oh my God, I haven't stopped talking all day because I'm on the phone. What about?
Right.
I think working remotely, it's harder to turn off since you're always like in your office.
Yeah.
When you say you're always in your office, is that I'm assuming you're basing your example off the fact that you perhaps like share the space that you have your computer or office in with some other use, whether it's your living room or your bedroom or something like that?
Yeah, your computer always being in reach, and people expect you to be home and by your computer, so they're expecting you to work when maybe you shouldn't be.
Right. All right, cool. Very good points. So we're going to start diving into this. So the key differences that I've noticed from my experience working from home are tasks versus time. So we're gonna touch on that one a little bit, the differences between the expectations that you have for work when you're in an office space versus when you're working from home, and how usually, since it's harder to track the time spent on a task, they usually just rely on a more task-based system where you just get assigned tasks and you just have to complete them. The other difference between office and home is the communication aspect of it. So obviously, whether it's a group meeting or a session like this that you're having online, with numerous people versus having a one-to-one chat with someone in a private conversation. Communication, it's going to take I think it takes a while for people to adapt to that style of communication because it's something that we've been growing towards, but I think a lot of people are still very familiar with the concept of just being in person and having the ability to just walk over and go talk to someone, which isn't necessarily always the case when you're working remotely, where perhaps you have a question for someone that's perhaps time sensitive and maybe they're not at their computer because they stepped away for a minute and they're not able to answer that question right away. The other topics are hours. So obviously, there's usually some level of flexibility involved since it's more task-based and not time-based, where as long as you get your tasks done, there's more flexibility for the hours that you work. And then productivity is another big one, which can be a positive or negative, based on whether you have more work to do, less work to do. And again, like we just talked about, the fact that, how technology has just taken over our lives and how it's always within a grasp, within reach, that it's sometimes a little harder to be able to make a break between what's work and what's your life. So to touch on tasks versus time, I think tasks provide a clear objective for people who work remotely. I think that something that is really beneficial to remote teams because you essentially project and you get done a task, and each person gets assigned various tasks, and it's a question of communicating and checking in, making sure that those tasks are progressing towards the goal to make a successful project. Difference as well with remote work is that you're working towards results as opposed to loss. So in that sense, you're not in the office working in the lab because what the standards are for people in lab spaces, and in that remote environment, there's list tasks that you start with when you get on your calls, or when you start your work day, you have a list of tasks and you just work through them. And if you finish 2 hours early, then you finish 2 hours early, and you get that rewarding benefit for efficient work where you're essentially able to reward yourself by getting an extra 2 hours off for the rest of your day to go do something interesting, although perhaps not necessarily in these current situations with COVID. However, it's a lot more rewarding, I would say, in that aspect because you're able to take tasks and really kind of benefit from them in a more meaningful way. So now we're going to touch on communicating.
Nate, one of the things that I was thinking though is that particularly for the students now, they don't have a list, right? Their list is unlimited. They can continue to study for as long as they want. So how would they turn that off to take a break?
So, well, that's where you have to look at a list of, you look at your course outline, for example, and you look at how you've got the endless possibilities for things that you could be learning, and you have to decide where you want to draw that line. So if you want to draw that line at what the course outlines, or if you want to draw that line at what it outlines, and maybe there's some additional tasks that you can do as well, additional coursework, you have to figure out where you want to draw that line, and you have to draw that line for yourself, because that helps you then determine what needs to be done. So you essentially set the benchmark for yourself as to what that list of tasks is, and then you can go through the process of actually checking those off one by one as you go through them.
Does anyone on the call have any of that kind of issue about wanting to turn it off? Or are you all pretty comfortable?
One thing for me is when I make too big of a task list, I know that it's not, I realize it's not as effective. I realize that it's much better for me to go day by day and make my task list for the day, the current day. I find that helps me kind of check in and check in on my priorities each day versus making a big task list that may change over time.
And I suppose that, yeah.
I was just going to say, perhaps that's where you take a list of all the tasks that you can do throughout the course, and you wake up in the morning and you say, okay, what do I want to do today? And you look at 2 or 3 tasks that interest you and you say, okay, I'm going to do at least these 2. And you go through the process and you do those 2. And then maybe if you just really enjoy yourself doing those, then you can do more. But at least, you kind of set a bar for yourself, and as long as you surpass that bar, that's all that really matters.
Yeah. And Priyanka's saying that probably they're pretty comfortable. Huh. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say I think the coursework, especially for classes, is I think it's really well set up the way it's showcased with all the different weeks and what you're supposed to learn each week. It's very well broken down, so I think it's really optimized to help with mitigating issues in that department, at least from what I've experienced with my time at the college. Um, okay, so going back to communication. Um, One thing that's really important is having internal and external meetings on a frequent basis. So the idea here is that you're trying to compensate for the lack of in-person meetings and the ability to obviously just go up to someone and ask them a question to make sure you're on the same page. The idea with these meetings is that you're able to voice your concerns, ask questions, and allow the team that you're working with to be on the same page and to clarify any issues on a regular basis to avoid things stretching out over time and leading to two completely separate paths, kind of straining the productivity of a team. The other component to those meetings is obviously having an agenda for each meeting. So agendas are very helpful because they really give you a clear idea as to what the topics that need to be covered are, and they allow you to maintain focus while you're in that meeting and not get distracted by potential arguments and other banter that might happen throughout the call. Offline communication. So what is this? So this is something that I've heard numerous times, whether it's on virtual team meetings or in-person meetings. It's a common term that I've found in business that I'm not sure a lot of people or not everyone knows what it means. So I just wanted to throw this in here and kind of offer some insight into that. Usually, if you're going off topic, you're veering off from the agenda, and you want to really clear up a misunderstanding or some differing opinions on a specific project related task, that's where you would probably want to what they call take that conversation offline and have a conversation with that person that you're having the disagreement with offline, meaning taking it to another time slot with just you and them, or just resolving it over text in a private message. Those are the various types of ways you could kind of resolve that in a virtual setting. um, so that's something that I think is very important to, again, maintain that cohesiveness within the team and make sure that everyone's on the same page. Uh, so the next part would be finding a balance. This is one that we briefly talked on and how it's kind of tough with technology being so at the ready and within reach. I think this is a really big one to set boundaries for yourself. And again, it's not the easiest thing. I've answered emails and private messages 2 in the morning, so I struggle with it myself as well. It's something that just takes time to get used to. And I think the important thing to do here when it comes to finding that balance is setting those boundaries. So if you want to have yourself just like a normal 9 to 5 kind of work schedule, then it's about setting those boundaries within 9 to 5 and making sure that within those hours you are attentive and able to answer questions within a reasonable time frame, maybe like a 5 to 10 minute window, and ensuring that you clearly communicate those boundaries to the rest of the team so that they know when they can expect you to answer them and when they can expect you to take a lot longer to respond to their concerns and messages, whatever they might be reaching out to you with. The other aspect of the communication part for virtual teams is also having fun and socializing, because it's a lot of you spend a lot of time with these people, whether it's on virtual meetings or in projects together. So obviously you want to make sure you build some sort of fun ways to interact with one another to really enjoy that time that you guys are spending as a team working together. And it's also just, as someone who works from home, you may not have as much time socializing as you would necessarily have if you had an office. Maybe you're not going out for coffee with people twice a day, chatting about stuff. Maybe you're not going to dinner right after work because someone offered to take everyone out for drinks or dinner. So obviously, finding ways to kind of make that interaction more enjoyable is definitely an important part.
Do you do fun things with your office mates online?
Yeah, we have interesting discussions. Usually, what we'll do is we'll have discussions on current events and stuff like that when we have some spare time in our meetings at the end once we've covered our agendas. And I think that's just maybe more mentally stimulating than banter and games and whatnot. But
Yeah.
I consider it quite fun and entertaining, so I would say so. Um, So like hours is another really big topic, and this is where we kind of start diving into it. I touched on it in the sense of like, working a 9 to 5 and so on and so forth, but there's a lot more to it than that. And you got to look at global markets and global hours, right? Because Asia is, for example, another big kind of big part of the world, and they're most part within like a 8 to 12 hour difference depending on where you are in the world. And so that's another big part of it, right? You got the Europeans that are 4 to 8 hours ahead of us, and then you've got Asia, which is 12 hours ahead of us, depending on where you are. Um, so there's a lot of room for pros, but there's also some cons to this aspect of it. So it's about being mindful of the hours that you work within the market that you work in, right? So some companies will be focused on markets that are only North American or North American and European or European and Asian and so on and so forth. And so that's where being mindful of those hours is very important, because you could find yourself working a job as a project manager or as a developer for a team that's based out of maybe it's based out of France, for example. So you've got a 5 hour difference between the East Coast and France. So you want to be mindful of that. So you might have to wake up earlier, but then you might end up going to bed earlier. And so it's about adjusting your routine. And there's a lot of things that go into that, and you look at even North America by itself, right? North America by itself it spans over 3.5 time zones if you count the Atlantic time zone. So there's a big gap there. For example, like if you're waking up at 9 o'clock in the morning to start your work, the people on the West Coast might not be up because it's 6 a.m. for them. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind when you're working remotely and when you're working with teams of people that are kind of spread out throughout the globe. And there's a lot of pros and cons to that. So obviously it's 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 turning into something that I think is a lot more than just finding a company you want to work for and that works in an industry you want to work for. I think there's going to be a lot more kind of more cultural, more company culture and um, localization components that come into play when people start looking for jobs in the coming years.
And I think in the data field, it's going to be very common that you're going to be working with partners in offshoring roles. So like with India or the Philippines, which
Yeah,
means that you'd have to be working off cycle. And for next semester at George Brown, many students are going to be allowed to study from their home countries for
that's
parts of the
great.
semester. And so that means that in the teamwork and everything that the students are going to have to do this coming semester, um, that they're going to have to figure out how to deal with these issues of global hours and the idea of rotating back and forth. So sometimes you'll meet on North American hours, sometimes you'll meet on Indian hours, and how to rotate and be respectful of people's different local time zones. It'll be a great
Right.
experience to get on the resume to have that global perspective.
Yeah, and like a perfect example of this is my schedule, for example. I have adjusted my schedule, keeping in mind the fact that Nate, my colleague here, is on the West Coast. I have a schedule that has me waking up a little bit later in the day than he might. And the aspect there is also just that, I mean, it's something that helps us work better as a team, but it's also something I would say has been beneficial because it's kind of helped me mitigate the adjustments I've had to make when I started working this job. Because I came from working as a server in a restaurant working dinner shifts. So I was used to being up until 3 or 4 in the morning anyways. So for
Yeah.
me to mitigate the amount of change in my routine has been very helpful to my ability to perform.
Yeah.
So that's very important. And then again, the last topic here for the hours is the time for self. So I think in that sense, like we said, communicating what your hours are to your teammates using the communication component, and making sure that you make some time for yourself. It doesn't have to be the rest of that day. It doesn't have to be from 5 p.m. until 9 a.m. the next day, but at least allotting some time for you to just have some personal time to just do whatever you want. Whether it's cooking, learning a new skill, doing whatever it is you want to do. It's really important to have that time for yourself where you shut everything off. You don't answer emails, you don't answer messages. You just have that time for yourself. That's a really big component that helps with productivity, which is our next topic. So for productivity, there's really 3 key points here. So motivation. So obviously, I think the key here is finding something that interests you, and that's not always a luxury that everyone can have, but I think the important part is to find a way to make it interesting for yourself. Maybe you're working for a company that's maybe not in a field that you're necessarily interested in, but there's always ways to make it interesting for yourself. Whether it's looking at the company objectively and finding ways to help improve their systems or how they operate or anything of that sort. There's plenty of ways to find motivation within a company, even if it's not necessarily the perfect company that you'd be looking for. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people usually they'll settle for a job that they don't like, and they'll just kind of huff and puff around and just kind of complain about it all the time instead of being more proactive and finding ways to make it interesting for them. And that helps with productivity in the long term, along with team dynamics, which is another key component because nowadays most people work teams, and that's something that we've touched on a couple times already, but just touch on it again very briefly. The team dynamics are a very, very big component of productivity. And I think, it's about having a good understanding with your teammates, having clear expectations of one another, and being able to really clear any issues up effectively through communication is a really big one. And it's a lot harder to do over virtual teams because people are still adjusting to the idea of virtual teams, and conflict resolution can already be a struggle as is with in-person meetings. So I can only imagine how it could be for certain teams over virtual teams, or virtual meetings or whatnot. So that's another big one to keep in mind.
Can you guys imagine doing that? Your teamwork next semester virtually? No?
Anyone have
Okay.
any thoughts on that?
Any thoughts on that? No.
Well, here's
Yeah.
another question, I guess. What are some of the aspects of in-person meetings that you feel remote meetings lack? Let's touch on that briefly. See if we can make a connection there.
Remote meetings, oh, body language for sure.
Body language, that's a good one. So, how do you think body language could affect team dynamics in positive ways or negative ways? Obviously, there's benefits to both, but what do you think that body language gives off that you couldn't communicate in a meeting?
I mean, true level of interest, I would think.
Right. So that, yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it really comes down to having the ability to truly understand where people's thoughts lie, right? And having a really effective team is beneficial, and that's where obviously body language comes into play, and the interest level of all the team members is a very big component to productivity. You can be persuasive and open by showing it, even by how entering a meeting room. Yeah, so even entering the meeting room can kind of state where you stand with respects to what's being discussed in that meeting. That's very true as well. That's another big one that is taking quite a bit um, of that body language and that certain level of that value from in-person meetings away, which I think is something that could be compensated for through communication. It's a certain level of communication that I don't think we have seen as a common expectation within perhaps at least North American cultures, if not all cultures around the world. So I think that that's something that's going to take some adjustment to for people for sure.
And you have to get used to the use of emojis. What does that emoji
Yes, that
mean? I have no idea.
I never understood that one either. That one's it's a bit of everything mixed into it. It's just a little over the top if you ask me.
Yeah.
All right, so the other component of the other component is mindfulness, and this is Maslow's chart of self-actualization, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. Um, and the most important part there at the top, the blue cone, is the desire to become the most one can be. And so I think there's a lot of benefits to uh, maximizing your efficiency for both productivity's sake and also just for your own mental health and your own sense of mindfulness, right? So for this, we're going to touch on these few topics here. So obviously creating a routine. So having a routine that you can kind of maintain consistently, maintaining your body. So in various aspects, I'm going to touch on meditation and a few other components. And then making sure, obviously, we talked about making time for yourself. So obviously that comes in the sense of personal time and social time. And then setting goals, because I think goals are a very important thing for you to maintain. And that's very similar to the tasks that we were talking about earlier, and making tasks and assessing what you want to accomplish today versus tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So I think for the routine component, the really important part is to have a weekly routine. So when I talk about a weekly routine, what I'm kind of hinting at here is essentially not sleeping in on Saturdays and Sundays. It's about maintaining that routine that you have, where perhaps you go to sleep at 1 o'clock in the morning and you wake up 8 hours later because 8 hours of sleep just works for you. So you go to bed at 1, you wake up at 9. It's about maintaining that routine, whatever you might find that works for you throughout the entire week. Because sleeping in, I've read a few articles actually that suggest that sleeping in on the weekends, sleeping in that extra hour really, really messes your sleep schedule up. And so it's actually more deterring than if you were to just maintain that consistent routine throughout every day of the week. Obviously, what comes with that is the quality of your sleep, right? So just because you sleep 8 hours doesn't necessarily mean you've gotten good quality sleep. So it's about finding whatever it is that might be distracting you in your sleep. Maybe it's thoughts going through your head that keep you up at night, or maybe it's something work related that's really stressing you out. It's about finding what those things are and working through them to kind of help you maintain a good quality sleep. And then obviously the other thing that ties with that work schedule. So maintaining a schedule that allows you to accommodate your work based on whatever hours you might be working. We touched on global markets, 12-hour differences in time zones, and so on and so forth. That can really impact your work schedule and how that might fluctuate over time. So the other component here is obviously your body. So daily exercise. I think this one's more so relevant now than ever before with quarantine and whatnot. I think it's really important to get some exercise because it's really tough to get motivated when you're stuck indoors all day. Fresh air is another good one. Um, I think just getting out, stretching your legs, you can kind of hit two birds with one stone. It's a little tricky right now, but obviously, like as someone who works from home, this is kind of something you need to be mindful of because you don't want to kind of stay stuck at home all day and end up just getting into bad habits of not leaving the house because that's just an unhealthy behavior. Meal routines, obviously, you want to make sure that you have a routine for your meals and you're not just eating all over the place whenever and whatever. That's something that really kind of, I think the idea of like a meal routine really helps maintain maintain your body and obviously making sure that you stay healthy and you have it also benefit your sleep quality as well. Meditation's another big one, and I think this one I want to touch on just a little bit deeper because it's something that um, I didn't really understand until fairly recently. That meditation doesn't necessarily mean sitting down on the floor cross-legged and just closing your eyes and whatnot. It can be any form of relaxation to some extent. The idea of it is you really just want to you can do whatever you want. I personally, I'll just lie down on my bed and do this, and it's about focusing on something. There's a video that I was shown recently where this monk talks about how there's a little monkey brain inside your head, and it's not about shutting the monkey's mouth. It's about giving him something to think about. So you basically want to focus on your breathing, and that gives the monkey something to do, is focus on breathing. And there's always going to be background noise, which is there, and it's totally fine. You don't have to worry about the background, just let it be. And this is something that I never really realized until recently, and it has done me wonders when I'm stressed out from work, if I have any issues with um, when I had issues with school and it was tough. Just lying down in bed, I would lie down on my bed for 30 minutes, just completely zone out, and I would kind of come back up fresh, and it was like starting the rest of my day, and I would end up accomplishing so much more than I would have ever done if I had not taken that 30 minutes to pause and really reset myself. So the next component I'm going to talk is posture, obviously. I think that's a really big one because a lot of people can get into a bad habit where they're perhaps slouching on their desk, on their computer because they're on those meetings all day and they're just struggling with it. I know I have struggled with it for a while. I thankfully now have a fancier sit-stand desk, so I'm actually standing right now giving this presentation, which feels a little more at home for me. But it's about maintaining that posture, right? So obviously, some of the stuff that I do to help maintain my posture is I try to get up every hour or two at the very minimum, and I'll do stretches and I'll just walk around the house a little bit just to make sure my posture is proper before I sit back down on my desk. And obviously, sometimes I'll stand at my desk, which also helps avoiding the sitting aspect of sitting at a desk. So all of those are kind of important, I would say, for your body's aspect. Social hours, I think this is pretty straightforward. We talked on the office component earlier, but obviously making time for family and friends is a really big one. I think making sure that you're not sinking yourself too deep into work to the point that you forget about family and friends. It's important. Outside of COVID, this being a kind of odd time for this kind of aspect of things. It's about making time to go hang out with people, get that social interaction aspect in that really kind of helps people stay upbeat and really helps people stay connected with one another. And I think that's the key to a longer life and a happier life is social interaction in any way, shape, or form. And obviously with COVID, it's a little harder to do it in person, but there's plenty of other methods and ways to go about it nowadays with social media and video chat, conferencing systems, and so on and so forth. And then, yeah, so leaving the office is a big one. So it kind of goes hand in hand with what we talked about earlier, making time for yourself. And whilst that technology is perhaps always around and available for you, one thing that I found that's helped me is essentially having two different profiles. So um, I have a laptop that I do some work on sometimes, and I've got two different and I've got one for my work stuff that's I've got all my work stuff signed into, and then I have a personal one that I use sometimes for other, like if I'm watching Netflix on my bed or whatnot, where I will just have all my personal credentials logged in there, and I don't have any of my professional stuff set up on it. So that's something that's really helped me kind of in my own way disconnect myself from the office and has allowed me to really kind of make that time for myself.
That's a good one because then your messages don't pop in while you're watching a movie.
Yeah, that's the other really big part is it's really nice in that it's a really good way to just completely disconnect. Okay, so I'm going to talk on like personal stimulation. So obviously, like activities, games. There's all sorts of stuff to do. Like playing sports is a good example of that. Whether you like playing football, ultimate frisbee, soccer, it doesn't really matter. Just some sort of stimulation, whether it's alone or with friends. Finding that work balance we've talked on a few times, and then obviously personal fulfillment. So that's going to tie in with our next point, which is goals and setting goals for yourself. But the idea is to find a balance between these three kind of components and set yourself up. And I think there's a lot of games out there that are kind of beneficial towards professional careers in indirect ways. They'll teach you soft skills, they'll teach you all sorts of valuable lessons that you will benefit from in the long term. So I think there's a lot of discredit towards games, and I think that it's not all it's chalked up to be, and in the sense that there's a lot of benefits to it that some people might miss out on just from shallow views on what video games provide. So touching on goals here, I think there's all sorts of different types of goals. There's educational, personal, social, and work goals. So whether work goal could be something like optimizing a spreadsheet, for example. Maybe you're just like, man, this spreadsheet's cool, but what if I did this? And you start kind of trailing down a path where you're thinking about like all these different changes you could make to something and make it more optimized and start using formulas, and you just start going off. Um, I think those could be beneficial from an educational standpoint and a work standpoint, because maybe you're learning to use new formulas, maybe you're learning all these things that benefit you on an educational level for yourself, but also benefit the work that you're utilized for, right? And then social goals are something that's important to have. Maybe you're playing on a team and you've set yourself a goal to, run faster by the end of the season, or maybe you're trying to catch X amount of frisbees by the end of the season, or score X amount of points. Setting up those goals for yourself gives you something to work towards and something to kind of to see yourself achieve in the long term, and it gives you something to that motivates you, and that motivation can cross over into your work life the same way people say they struggle with work in kind of impeding on their personal life. It's almost like a two-way street, right? So that's where you can kind of see it perhaps as an exchange, where while you might sometimes have issues where work kind of bleeds into your personal life, it kind of goes both ways, where maybe those goals that you for yourself on a personal level allow you to feel more motivated, and that motivation might lead to better productivity in the workplace. So that's it for the mindfulness component. So talking about contracting, this is some of the topics that I'm going to touch on from my experience as a contractor. Um, Again, I'm going to touch on these. This is a pretty light portion. If you guys have any further questions for this component specifically in terms of the gig economy and working as an individual contractor and so on and so forth, you're more than welcome to add me on LinkedIn and ask me any questions you have. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have, whether they're in here in the chat while I'm still presenting or afterwards.
Is anyone currently doing contract work? No? Show of hands? No. Okay. And would anybody be interested in doing that in the next couple of months during COVID stuff? Not right now? Oh, of course, fate would. Yeah, sure. I would do it. Did I just block you off?
No, I got a message on my end. I think my internet had a little issue here. Let me just put it back up.
Okay. Is it, I
There
mean,
we
that,
go.
I think if anything comes up, I think it'll be contract or project work for the next little while.
Right.
And they're good to have.
Yeah. So yeah, so when it comes to contracting, there's a few components to it. So obviously the X time positions, what I'm referring to there is you'll sometimes find yourself working positions that are considered quarter time or half time, where you're getting paid for that quarter time or half time position. So that's where unlike an environment like a corporate environment where you might find yourself just on salary and you're working, 8 hours a day, when you're contracting, there's a bit more flexibility there. So the flexibility comes from being able to choose what kind of projects you work on, choosing some level of flexibility with regards to the hours you work. And sometimes, you'll find yourself working 3/4 time projects, and so you'll end up being working 3/4 times instead of full time. But you'll find yourself maybe doing some more interesting projects, and also juggling 3 projects is not an easy task. So that's where you might give yourself that extra time to kind of make up for the extra communication and whatnot that you need to take part in for 3 different projects simultaneously. Those are very important components to think of when you're planning your work schedule for the upcoming months, and you're looking at projects that may last 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months or more, and making sure that there's overlap. And the other part that ties in with this is planning. So obviously planning is a very big component of contracting, because you need to plan for yourself in the sense that you need to look at projects that you're working on that perhaps are 2 or 3 months away from finishing, and start looking for other projects to kind of fill that gap. I think that's a really big component of it, because if you end up finishing a project and then looking for work, then you will find yourself with typically an empty void of about a month or two until you find said project that will that will lead you to not have any income for that time period. And so that's where planning is a really big component, where you want to make sure you manage your time properly and you start looking for projects before the ones you currently work on are finished, because that's a really big component. And this could also be applied to job hunting. Just because you have a job doesn't necessarily mean there isn't something better out there, or there isn't something more engaging or interesting that you want to do out there, or maybe there's an opportunity for you to do 2 jobs at once. So that's where it kind of goes hand in hand, getting comfortable with the idea of doing the job searches while you still have a job that you currently maintain. So those are very important components. Then there's the aspect of individuals versus companies. So I contract myself out to companies as a company of my own. So I'm a one-man company, and that's how I contract myself out. The reasoning behind that is because I currently get paid in a different currency than Canadian dollars, and so it's more convenient for me to do it as a company. And there's also some other benefits there within within international businesses. But there's also perfectly fine ways to do it as an individual and contract yourself out as an individual to companies with very little negative side effects to it, with taxes being one of those that I'm going to touch on in just a minute. Currencies are another big thing, right? Because if you're contracting to companies that are in Asia or in other parts of the world, you might find yourself with conversion issues. So maybe that's where something where you can expect them to convert the money for you and get paid X of euros or Canadian dollars, whatever currency you so choose. But that is something that kind of becomes more and more relevant as you find yourself contracting to a global market that uses various currencies within that global economy. Traveling is another interesting component of contracting. It's not something I've necessarily experienced all that much of yet, but I know that it's something that a lot of people in the contracting world do experience, where they either go to meet their clients face to face, or they're traveling to do some research for a specific project, or any sort of various aspects of traveling, whether it's for work or a client. I'm considering moving to Europe just because I get paid in euros, and so the conversion would be more practical. But there's various other components to it. It's about optimizing your life for what you see fit and what you enjoy. And taxes. So, like I said, I'm going to touch on taxes. The important thing to remember here is that as a contractor, you typically get paid the net value. Is it the net value? No, you're getting paid a revenue, and taxes aren't taken into account. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that sometimes as a contractor, when you get paid gross, thank you, that's the word I was looking for. So you get paid gross value, and you need to take taxes into account when you're getting paid as a contractor, because they don't get automatically removed from your paycheck. You're getting paid that gross value. You need to give yourself that net value and be mindful of the taxes that you will incur on those payments that you get. So that's kind of a high level overview of my experience as a contractor and the things that I've learned. Thanks, Alex. And that's what I have to share with with regards to contracting. So again, if you guys have any questions or want some further insight, feel free to let me know. I'm gonna just kind of start to wrap this up with some insights. So I think, work calls, planning, and time zones in the gig economy are kind of some key components that we're going to touch on for finalizing these insights. The work calls are a really big thing for virtual teams. As you can imagine, we're on a virtual call right now, basically. Microphone etiquette's a really big topic, because I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, but I know I sure have experienced it, where people were perhaps had their microphone open when they shouldn't have been, when they weren't talking, and you hear a lot of noise in the background and stuff that you maybe shouldn't have to hear necessarily. And it's about making sure that checking all your tech before you even before you join the meeting. Some of these tools offer the ability for you to check your microphone and all that stuff before it's set up. And then obviously, it depends on the size of the meeting, right? So if you've got a meeting with 5 or 10 people and you're very familiar with all of them, and there's a lot of engagement expected from each member of that team for that hour-long meeting, maybe that's something where you don't mute your microphone, because you're going to have to talk a lot and you're going to have to interact and have discussions about various topics. But then if that's the case, then it's about ensuring that you find a space where you can actually do that without having too much background noise, where it makes it hard for people to hear you or any like that. And then on the flip side, maybe you've got a meeting with 50 plus people, and maybe it is best if you have your answers shared through a text chat versus voicing it out on the call, to make it more proactive and easier for people to understand what's going on throughout that meeting. So it's about kind of using your judgment to really assess what the best way to communicate what you have to communicate is within. And obviously that comes mostly with experience and time, but it's about being mindful of how many people are in the meeting and how that benefits, how you speaking up versus typing benefits the team, if it's something that's important or if it's something that can just be mentioned in a chat, and so on and so forth. Check-ins is another really big one that I think is important, in the sense that sometimes, you'll ask a question and there'll be silence. And that silence can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. And sometimes you ask people a question and they just need time to think. Sometimes they're just sitting there and they're just working through the problem in their head before they give you an answer, instead of just jumping to conclusions. And that's totally fine. It's something to be expected um, in meetings virtually, just as you would expect them perhaps in a physical meeting. And I think, just like we talked about body language and physical cues, those are things that you perhaps are missing from meetings, especially if you have a meeting without cameras involved, which I think a lot of people are shifting towards having cameras involved, but not everyone does. So it's about just checking in, it's about just saying, hey, I'm not hearing a whole lot, what's going on, and that's where someone can be like, oh, I'm just thinking about this, I'm just working through the problem, just give me a minute. And that kind of ties back in with the communication aspect. It's just like, let me think about this, I'm just working through it, and really being able to communicate to the team so that they can proactively either move forward with the agenda or just sit back and wait until that problem gets resolved, depending on the importance of it. And then discussions is another really big one. So obviously, cross culturally, there's differences between how different groups or different cultures work through discussions and disagreements and problems. Um, I think in North America, for example, we're pretty clear about it. Maybe we'll kind of move past it within the meeting and maybe step aside and have one of those offline discussions like I talked about earlier. Or maybe I know people in Europe, especially in France, they really just want to clear things up right then and there, and so they'll have an argument and they'll talk it through and they'll come to resolution at some point. But having those quote unquote heated arguments that we would typically consider inappropriate in North America is something that you could expect as something more common, in at least in France, from my experience. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you're having these virtual meetings, is understanding where these people are based from, if they're in Europe, in Asia, in the US, or in North America, and what those standards are for them, and kind of being more open-minded about how their resolution skills differ along with various other aspects of communication, And then finally, like the agendas, like I've touched on this a few times, but again, just to reiterate how important it is, maintaining that agenda that really helps the team stay on point and on topic to optimize those work calls and make sure that they're as productive as possible. Because the last thing you need as a virtual team member is to spend 6 hours on calls during a day to hash out stuff that ends up with you only putting 2 hours of actual concrete work into the day. And that just doesn't help with productivity from a personal standpoint and from a company standpoint. So it's about making sure that those work calls are utilized as best as possible, and making sure that you're able to really get what needs to be done at the end of the day. Now we're going to talk on planning. So I've touched on this again a few times. There's strategic resource planning and obviously like the roles within teams. So, you know, the resource planning is really about determining what members you need in your team. Maybe you're developing a website, so you need some full stack developers, you need a project manager, you need a designer, you need like a UI UX guy, maybe have someone for animations. It's about figuring out what those resources that you need are, and about figuring out the roles that each member plays within the team. And I think knowing what each member's, like as an individual, knowing what your role is within that team is very, very important, because it is sometimes misunderstood, and it's something that I haven't really had to experience yet firsthand, but I've witnessed it experienced from another project manager, where there's some lines that get blurred by people, and it leads to less productivity and more conflicts, which leads to poor team dynamics, which just turns into a snowball effect, leading to a project that should take 6 months taking 9 months. So it's about maintaining that mindfulness in the back of your head about strategic planning. Obviously, just what strategies are you going to employ as a team to maximize your performance, and what's your role within the team, and making sure you keep that in mind. So for time zones, there's the thought process of continuous work and whether it works or not. And this is something I touched on a few times, with the idea being that North America starts developing something from a coding perspective, and then as they're getting off work, they pass it over to the Asian department that continues the development from wherever the US market left it off. And then it would then transfer over to the European area where they would take over. And the idea with this theory is that it would essentially provide continuous 24/7 ish development cycles. But the issue that's been found with this is that unless the people see eye to eye perfectly on the vision of that development cycle, it's nearly impossible to do it. And especially on a grander scale, when you look at something with hundreds of developers, this is something that becomes virtually impossible to complete. So while yes, there's a lot of benefits to having time zone differences and kind of crossovers with work, where you assign work to someone, perhaps you're in North America, you assign work to someone, and as you're going to sleep, they're getting up to work through it, so that when you wake up, they're finishing up their day and they've kind of completed stuff that you can review. There's benefits to it, but there's also a lot of negative sides to it. So it's about finding a balance with those things in mind that can benefit your team in the best way possible. And that's where I think, having smaller teams of 5 or 6 people can really shine in this sense of time zones, where you can benefit from maintaining communication through small team chats and staying on the same page, so that there's little deviation in regards to what that final product that you're working towards becomes. And then we touched on differing cultures and obviously routine times. So obviously, just touching on those briefly again, just being mindful of other people's cultures based on where they are in the world, and being more open-minded about how things are done where you are versus how they get done where they might be somewhere else around the world. So just to touch on the gig economy to wrap things up here. It's really just project based. You'll find that a lot of it's project based, where, like I said earlier, you got to plan your schedule out to accommodate for multiple projects and overlap. And maybe you're not working full time, but you've got yourself set for the next 12 to 18 months on projects that are upcoming. It's very different from employment. Employment is, you get a fixed salary each month, and you get tasked whatever projects your boss decides to put you on. So while the money might perhaps be more consistent, there's less fluctuations with it, which could be something that you prefer, and maybe that's what you want to go down the path of. But project-based work in the gig economy provides you, I would say, with more flexibility to choose what you work on and make your own hours, along with all sorts of other components that I've touched on. The flexibility is another benefit, and schedule management, and then your personal brand. The personal brand aspect, I think, is something that's really important, because people might perhaps kind of lose sight of that component of themselves when they're starting to work in the gig economy, and they might just see themselves as just trying to find work and just working on projects back to back based on whatever's available, and perhaps not necessarily what they find interesting. And even if they find something interesting, it's about finding a way to bring that into your personal branding and kind of help bring you up and promote yourself as someone who finds interest in those types of projects, because that helps grow your personal brand and helps showcase to other people that you have interest in these types of projects, and could perhaps lead to you having more exposure to people looking for projects and project teams for those types of projects down the road.
Nathaniel, where do you promote yourself for gigs?
So I'm actually very happy with the work that I'm doing now. So I haven't really been out and about looking per se. But I know that I've just been doing a lot of networking, maintaining my network, and um, I've just used LinkedIn really. Like LinkedIn has been a good place for me to connect with people and have discussions. I've just that's really what I've been doing.
Because Michael's asking, is looking for project-based work the same process as looking for a full-time job?
Yeah, I would say it's got a lot of similarities. It's perhaps a job interview in and of itself in the same sense, um, because you might find yourself contracting yourself out as a worker for a company to work on a project where they might ask you to come back for another project if they like the work you did, right? So that's where one project could also potentially lead to multiple projects down the road if you sell yourself right. So it could be the same in that sense where for a full-time job, you want to sell yourself as best as possible because you are trying to sell yourself to a full-time position. And you, obviously in a corporate environment, they have so many people that are likely coming in and going that you want to be the best candidate for them to choose from, right? And very similarly in project-based work, you want to be that best candidate for them because you give them an opportunity to reconsider you for future projects that they work on. And typically, if you're being hired by a company to work on a project, whether it's directly for them or for a client that they have, it typically leads to the possibility for more work to come from that. Now, does it necessarily guarantee anything? No, of course not, because like I've said, it's really mostly based on project work and things are kind of left up in the air in a lot of cases where you'll work a project and maybe you just won't hear back from that company ever again. But that possibility for you to get more work from them is a really big selling factor towards similarizing, if that's even a word, the process. So I would say that they are very similar in that sense, yes.
And I think I heard networking, whether it's
Yeah.
online networking or in-person networking.
Yes, and so that's where obviously, connecting with the people that you're working on the team with is a really big benefit because maybe you won't get another project from that company that you were hired by, but perhaps one of your team members that you get along with, if you have a good dynamic with the team, maybe they find themselves a job, 2 or 3 months later after the project is wrapping up, and that project needs a project manager, for example. Let's use me as an example, right? So maybe I'm a project manager. I worked with Nate on a project or Karen on a project, and they find themselves lined up with another project, and they're asked by the person who hires them, they're like, hey, we need a project manager for this. Do you know anyone? And that's where Karen or Nate can be like, hey, I know this guy Nathaniel, who's a really good project manager who could come on board and start in a week or two.
And so, and because when all my contracts, all my consulting projects, I've gotten through networking, 100%, or through a referral from somebody who recommended me for the job.
And I would say that, networking is something that you can do kind of proactively throughout time, but I also am of the belief that getting networking becomes exponentially easier through work experience.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that's the really big thing is that I've been showcasing the idea of choosing your work through project-based contracting, but it's also not the worst idea, especially when you're first starting off, to just be a little less picky and just expand your horizons in the sense that you provide yourself with a job opportunity that maybe isn't as interesting as you might like, but the trade-off is that you essentially give yourself the ability to have experience and network with more people.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the statistics are people that are 35 and younger will have 7 to 8 jobs by the time they turn 35. So
Yep.
graduate. and that suggests that it's a gig economy, whether you're an employee or not, perhaps.
Yeah, that sounds pretty accurate to me.
Yeah. Michael, is that helpful? Yeah. Nice, Mike. Nathaniel, that was very helpful.
Glad to hear. Yeah, it was a blast to present it too.
And I think, if we think back over the schedule of the sessions that we've had in this break, there's been a lot of technical stuff for sure, and but the importance of stepping back to think about how do we the softer sides of the situation that we're in a transition for job search to try to balance the work, balance our lives during this time of looking for jobs, transitioning from study to full-time jobs, and using our time as effectively as possible while we're stuck inside during COVID.
Right.
Any comments from the gallery? Any last questions for Nathaniel? There's a thank you from Fate.
It was a pleasure.
Priyanka, you good? You're off to meditate? Priyanka's a meditator. All right, so don't forget the next session's coming up, which includes Nate Strand, which is going to continue his blockchain discussions tomorrow. And we're out of here for today. Thanks a lot, Nathaniel.
No problem. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Have a good afternoon.